Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. On the second Wednesday of each month, and often in between, we discuss the latest bioscience publications. And as a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to academic.oup.com/bioscience. Today's episode is the next in our In Their Own Words oral history series, in which we talk with scientists who have made great contributions to their fields, particularly in the biological sciences. This week's guest is Douglas Futuyma, Professor Emeritus of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York. He's also a past president of AIBS. Let's go straight to that interview. Dr. Futuyma, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Look forward to talking with you.
Okay, so our first question is, when did you first know that you wanted to work in the life sciences?
I guess that depends on, let's put it this way. Work in the life sciences is something that changed its meaning, of course, over the course of my life. I grew up in New York City in the Bronx, and very early in grade school became absolutely intrigued with the Bronx Zoo, which is the largest zoo in the country, at least at that time, and became a habitué of the Bronx Zoo, which is a really formative event in my life. I was there every day after school and so forth. In grade school, by the sixth grade, I was going there regularly to the point where a number of the personnel, the zookeepers, and eventually one of the curators got to know me because I was so present all the time. And so working in the life sciences is something that I wanted to do probably by the time I was in sixth or seventh grade. At that point, it meant becoming a zookeeper. That was my model, right? And of course, as time went on, I eventually started reading more, talking with some of those people. And as I said, one of the curators of the zoo, he was a PhD, James Oliver had a PhD in zoology and from the University of Michigan. And eventually I realized that one could do professional biology, that there were people who were writing books and writing research articles and so on. And so I had some dim idea that I could be some kind of biologist. I still didn't really know what that meant. Until really late in high school and then in college, when I realized that, there are these people called university or college professors, and that they teach biology, and they're living biology. And so that ultimately then, I would say by late high school, it became very clear to me that that's what I wanted to do. And that I wanted, of course, then to major in biology in college and pursue that wherever that might take me.
And I hope you won't mind if I take you back to the Bronx Zoo very briefly. Were there any particular exhibits that captured your imagination more so than others?
Absolutely. This is one of these things of sort of delayed gratification, because I'd been going there and looking at the bird exhibits and the mammal exhibits, and the reptile house was closed for renovation. And so that became this sort of, I was totally fixated on the idea that eventually I would get to see all the reptiles when they would finally reopen it. And at that point, I had already been starting to keep a few pets, like a pet anolis lizard and some salamanders and so forth at home. And when that finally opened, and it was beautifully done, that became my locus of activities, and those were the personnel that I got to know best, and so on. So that I actually then nurtured the idea of being a herpetologist from probably whatever that might exactly mean, from late grade school on through college actually, and went to graduate school with the intention of studying in the area and doing research in herpetology.
What ultimately changed directions for you?
I did indeed go to the University of Michigan, partly on the recommendation of James Oliver, the curator at the zoo, who I just mentioned, who was a herpetologist, and I got there, and there were two herpetologists on the faculty there, one of whom unfortunately died during my first year. And the other was, a very nice person, and certainly much admired and liked by his students. But the intellect, what I found intellectually then more exciting and appealing was really on the part of several of the other faculty, especially among the ecologists and a couple of other faculty there who were interested in, for example, the evolution of behavior. And so that really, then I realized that really what I was becoming more and more intrigued by were the larger general principles of evolution and ecology, and that was really what I wanted to work in, and that didn't necessarily mean being wedded to amphibians or reptiles. And so then my focus became, at that point in my life, less centered on a particular group of organisms, and more directed toward the larger ideas and theories and hypotheses.
What would you say is the biggest surprise of your career?
It depends. There are all kinds of surprises at different kinds of levels. I mean, in terms of my research, I guess we could say, well, something I certainly didn't expect was early on after I came to Stony Brook after graduate school, I had a research program going that involved studying the genetic variation in quite a number of different species of moths. For an issue having to do with, I was interested in whether genetic variation was related to the ecology of the species. And one of these species we discovered through the protein electrophoresis that we were using to study genetic variation. We discovered that most of the population reproduced asexually rather than sexually. And this was a total surprise. I wasn't aware that this had been described in any member of this very large family of moths. And so this was a real discovery. I mean, this is, there aren't that many species of animals, especially among insects, that reproduce asexually. And so this was, number one, very surprising. And number two, really satisfying in the sense that I could say that we discovered a real piece of knowledge that hadn't been known before, a real honest-to-God fact that hadn't been known before. So that's kind of, that's at the level of a research surprise. At the level of a career surprise, I guess I would have to say that just the very fact that I started being recognized enough to the point of, becoming president of AIBS and a number of other honors, and really becoming recognized and known to a far, far greater extent than I had ever imagined when I was a young faculty member. And so obviously that's very gratifying, and I feel humbled by it, really. But that's a real surprise.
This may actually go back a little bit to that initial discovery, but what's the biggest difference between the way that science is conducted now and the way that it was when you first entered the field?
Right, yeah. There are several ways. One is that there's a lot more what's being called big science going on. And in other words, I mean, a lot of the most significant publications they're multidisciplinary, and they involve collaborations among a large number of different people who make different kinds of contributions to the big picture, to a far greater extent than was the case when I was starting out. A lot of this involves, for example, what's being called big data, I guess, that vast databases in, whether it has to do with the distribution, geographic distribution of species, or genome sequences and so forth. So working at a level of data that is vastly greater than it had been, and often these very diverse collaborative teams on very, very big kinds of projects. So that is certainly a big difference, and that often then entails having skills that really have to be in some cases much more sophisticated in some ways than when I was starting out. I mean, I think you have to, in many areas of evolutionary biology, you really need to be very strong in data analysis of various kinds, and really advanced statistical methods in computer modeling, and a variety of analytical methods that are way beyond what I was trained in. And then the other aspect is that the field has become very much larger. There are far more people in the field. The meetings of the Society for the Study of Evolution now are, there are 10 times the number of people attending than there were back in the 70s, probably more. And it also means that everything's more expensive and everything's more competitive. So I would think that that it could be a lot more of a challenge for a young person just getting out of graduate school now than when I did.
Do you ever find yourself longing for days past when a project could be, perhaps more easily launched and undertaken by a smaller group of people or a smaller team?
Well, I mean, that is really the level at which that I've worked at pretty much all my life. I mean, all of my papers. I mean, what I'm saying is nowadays, I look and I see much of the literature is the primary research literature is being done by, as I say, these large multidisciplinary teams. My own work, my own history of research publishing was very much my graduate students and maybe one or two other co-authors, and so I've always felt much more comfortable in, if you like, the smaller arena of research.
How have professional societies played a role in your career? And is there any particular large events that come to mind?
I think professional societies are really important. And the two major ways are, first of all, by many of them, publishing journals, obviously. So that, and I think that's immensely important. And that's been very important in my career because I've held some editorial positions in that respect. But I think even more important is that they hold meetings, that they serve as a basis for the formation of a research community. And I don't mean by that just networking and trying to impress people and meeting them at meetings and trying to impress them. What I mean is that really there is a research community of people who know one another, very often like one another at a personal level, communicate with one another, help one another in various ways, recommend one another for various kinds of tasks and positions and so on. And so I certainly have benefited from that, and I think many people in at least in evolutionary biology have, and I think that's probably true in general. I think professional societies play a really important role. And I would encourage any young, a graduate student, postdoc, or whatever, someone starting their career, to be a member of at least one professional society. And sure you can see the journals online without paying for them, but that's not really the point. I think the point is really becoming a member of a community of researchers.
And do you think that role has changed over time, or is it largely, serving the same purpose that it always has? You mentioned that SSE has become larger in its meeting attendance.
Right. I think it's probably in some ways more difficult, but I think the same dynamics basically are playing out. Sure.
And how about your time working with AIBS?
Well, let's see. That was something like 17 years ago or so, something like that, 13 years ago, it was certainly rewarding for me. I don't know how much I did for AIBS. I think probably less than quite a number of other. I was first on the board of directors, and then I was president, and then past president. And I know that some other people in those positions that really did more for AIBS than I did. I did. There were a couple of things that I felt. Well, let me say, first of all, I really enjoyed it. There were very dedicated people at the time. In particular, I worked a lot with the executive director, who was Richard O'Grady, and he was the one who was really making things happen. He was the one who was really effective, and it was wonderful to work with him and the other personnel. I think the one thing that I tried to do, and I hope it has had some lasting effect, was to try to connect AIBS to other biological arenas. So AIBS has represented mostly the more organismal and ecological end of biology, which is very much my area of biology. But at the same time, you have this, much of the rest of biology, after all, which is cell biology, biochemistry, molecular biology, physiology, developmental biology, these more experimental fields, would have thought of them. And so one of the things that I did, I sort of do as president, was connect with FASEB, FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. And actually, it was coincidentally someone there kind of reached out to me because they were interested in bringing some evolution into some of their programs. And as exactly the same time that I was preparing to reach out to them to suggest that we might collaborate on something like the AIBS annual meeting, for which I was responsible for developing a program of talks for that meeting. And I decided on the general theme of evolutionary biology and human health. This was in the quite early days of what was being called Darwinian medicine, connecting evolutionary biology to health issues. And this was clearly an area where there could be, a joining together, a conjunction of evolutionary and ecological biologists with molecular cell biologists, biochemists, and so forth. And actually that symposium for that year then, to some extent, was a product of the crosstalk between us, between these two large umbrella societies. I think that continued for a while. I have to say I'm not sure that it has become a permanent affiliation with one another. But that was something that I tried to do. I've always been I think a hallmark of my way of thinking in my career has been the whole quest for synthesis, the whole idea that everything should fit together, and we shouldn't be competing with one another. We should be seeing how the various kinds of biology and approaches to biology inform one another and form a coherent intellectual whole.
Moving on from perhaps just the AIBS specific focus, but what event from your career do you think will be long remembered into the future?
I think you told me that this question might come up, and all I could say was that I was reminded of a short passage in Hamlet, where Hamlet is ruing the fact that that everyone seems to be perfectly jolly despite the fact that his father was murdered just a couple of months before, and Hamlet says, "There's hope. A great man's memory may outlive his life by half a year." In other words, I don't suppose that I'm going to be remembered long into the future, that any of the work will be remembered long into the future. And it is, something that's actually pretty distressing is, ask a graduate student what the accomplishments were of, name some famous names from the 40s or the 50s or the 60s, and you're likely to draw a blank. I think that I think I've done a few things that I think have been, I think useful and possibly important in their time. Whether or not I will be in any sense remembered for them, I don't know. I've had one or two ideas that I've published that I hope will turn out to be useful and ideas about, for example, the importance of speciation as a way of sort of locking in changes in characteristics of organisms so that they don't sort of become lost in time. I think some of the work the experimental work we've done, especially with leaf beetles, was designed to ask whether there are limitations on genetic variation that could direct the possible path of adaptation into certain paths rather than others. In other words, whether there are genetic constraints on the degree to which a species can adapt in any variety of ways, or whether they would be constrained in only very special ways. Here, what I was interested in is the ability of insects to adapt to different kinds of plants, and finding that, well, no, they have genetic variation that makes adaptation to certain plants more likely than to others. And I think that that's a useful contribution. I think that I think, though, that I'm probably best known kind of for just sort of, synthesizing ideas and putting them together in the form of my textbook in its various editions, and quite a number of other things that I've written, of really sort of trying to take an overview of how things fit together. And I'm obviously not the only person who does that, but I think that that's been useful. And then finally, one issue that I feel quite strongly about, and I'm one of a number of people who have been pretty vocal about this, is the importance of taxonomy and natural history. In other words, the importance of really knowing, of there being people who really know the diversity of organisms, who the species are, and more or less what they do. I think that if we did not have entomologists and ornithologists and systematic botanists and people of this kind who are naming species, who can tell you what species you're studying, and know the basic life histories and geographic distributions and phylogenetic relationships of species, if you didn't have them, then pretty much all of ecology and evolutionary biology and most of biology would be severely reduced and impoverished.
Yes, and that's often work that goes rather unheralded in comparison with some other fields.
Yeah, definitely, and I've written a few papers on this that I think have been a little influential.
Could you speak a bit about the role of outreach in your career? I know that you've written books for general audiences as well, particularly on evolution and making the case therefore.
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, you can have a perfectly, most research scientists do have very successful and rewarding careers without doing much of that. But I think that certainly as a community, and here we go back to the idea that there's a community of evolutionary biologists, there's a community of ecologists, and so on. As a community, it's enormously important to reach out, to educate, to inform the public, to help people think scientifically and logically and to some extent skeptically about what's going on. We are living that right now. Okay, here we are in the midst of this horrid coronavirus outbreak, in which have scientists who know what they're talking about. They know about the biology of viruses. They know about how pathogens like this spread. They know the dynamics. And some of that has been essentially diminished or poo-pooed, but including by some political figures. You have the leading disease epidemiologist in the United States, who has received death threats from people who think that he is saying that who just won't accept what he's saying about the need, for example, for self-isolation and social distancing. So here we are living through an episode in which science is all important. Okay, and there has to be, it seems to me, within society, a respect for science, a respect for expertise, a respect for people who are responsible ultimately for the discoveries, for understanding the foundations for all of the discoveries that are made in medicine and in engineering and in architecture, in every aspect of our lives. We are dependent for food, for transportation, for everything. We are dependent on understanding that has come from the basic sciences. Okay, and I think it is so important that people realize that, and that they not just pick and choose what science they're going to believe and which science they're going to belittle, whether it have to do with climate change or how you should behave during an epidemic. Okay, and so I think it is the responsibility of the scientific community, of the various scientific communities of ecologists, evolutionary biologists, epidemiologists, biochemists. It is their responsibility to educate, to reach out, to educate in whatever ways they think they can be effective to the public, and help to create an informed public that respects science, which is not always the case.
And that's a very incredibly important message, and I suppose now more than ever.
It is. I feel so strongly about this, and it's one of the things that when I was president, I wrote a couple of editorials for our journal, and one of them was to this effect. It was to the effect that you can't just pick and choose which science you're going to believe. It's like Al Gore talked about the inconvenient truth of climate change. You can't just decide I'm not going to believe the climate scientists. Even though every aspect of my daily life is dependent on what is ultimately the production of scientific knowledge.
Absolutely. And this may feed into the next question, or perhaps not, but what's the most frightening or intimidating thing that's happened to you in your professional capacity?
No, I mean, I guess I've been through some things that I suppose people might have found threatening, like some of the qualifying exams I had to face as a graduate student. But I have to say that actually I, in a way, almost looked forward to them because they forced me to learn about things that I didn't know. So I guess I can't say that I have any particular memory of something that has really frightened me. Yeah.
Well, no, that's a very enlightened view toward exams. But what are you working on right now?
Well, as I mentioned at the start, I'm an emeritus professor. So I retired from teaching and other university responsibilities it's a little year and a half ago or so. I'm still professionally active, and I'm glad to say. Am on several editorial boards, and that takes a bit of time of PNAS, and I'm the editor of the Annual Review of Ecology, Evolution, and Systematics. But those are kind of episodic duties, and I'm not doing research anymore. But I'm doing a lot of writing. At the moment, I'm writing not a scientific, not science per se, but at the moment I'm writing a book about basically the evolutionary biology of birds. I'm a very serious birder. I've been a birder since I was something like 12 years old, and have gotten back into that more and more over the last 20 years, going all around the world looking at birds and so forth. And I thought, well, when I see a bird, usually I view it not just for its aesthetic value, but also I view it from my position as an evolutionary biologist. And very often I know something about it, or I think of a question about it that other birders or people who just like birds might be interested in. And so this is a book that's intended for people who are not scientists but are enthusiastic about birds. And it's about various kinds of topics that I think I can sort of address as an evolutionary biologist that they might find interesting. And so that's a book that's nearing the end of writing the text of that. And then very soon I'll be gearing up with my co-author, Mark Kirkpatrick at the University of Texas, for the next edition of our textbook, Evolution. This will be edition 5 under that title. There were 3 previous editions under a different title, Evolutionary Biology. And this has been one of the things that I think has been a somewhat useful contribution to education in evolutionary biology. And I'm looking forward to doing that because, of course, every time I have had to revise and produce another edition, it means that I learn a great deal more than I knew before, and my entire life has been spent as much enjoying just the process of learning as the process of in any way contributing to what it is that people learn.
What's the experience been like of shepherding such a valuable and widely used textbook over the years? When do you know that it's time to put out the next edition, and how does that process work?
That usually comes from the publisher because the publisher would ideally like to have a new edition every 2 years, so that students aren't buying used copies. So I say that with a smile and a bit of not totally seriously, but semi-seriously. But I think that at some point you realize that sure, there are some areas of the field that haven't changed all that much. We pretty much know what's what. That's been solved. But there are other areas in which there are enormous advances happening every year in evolutionary biology, as they are throughout biology as a whole. And the most obvious, of course, in recent years has been genomics, and this has transformed many areas of evolutionary studies, from phylogeny to population genetics to understanding the genetic basis of adaptations, and that continues, of course, at a huge rate. so that the variety of interesting things there are to write about in terms of our knowledge of the genetic evolution and the phylogenetic history of all kinds of organisms and their all kinds of interesting characteristics, life histories and behaviors and morphological features, all kinds of features. All this information has been coming out in vast waves, and the challenge, of course, is to pick among it. What are you going to choose among all of these wonders that have been revealed to us year after year? And so probably on the order of every 4 or 5 years, you could say that, sure, it's probably time to revise, because at least some areas will have changed so much that that what you wrote 4 years ago wasn't wrong necessarily, but it's nowhere near as complete as our current state of knowledge.
And if you'll indulge another publishing question, because you've served on so many editorial boards and as an editor in so many prominent roles, how do you feel that the role of journals has changed over the years, or the task of a journal editor has changed over the years? Is it different or largely the same?
My impression is largely the same. As a journal editor, I think it's a job that's gotten very, very much more difficult because, as I just said, there are so many more people in the field. The volume of publishing, numbers of manuscripts that are turned out by the greatly increased numbers of researchers has just increased tremendously. When I was editor of Evolution from 1981 to 83. You asked earlier, what's the most surprising thing in my career? Probably the most surprising thing in my career was being asked in 1980, when I was just, what was I? I was 38 years old or so, to be the editor of the leading journal in the field. I mean, that was a surprise that just blew me away. You could insert that back into that other question. But what I was about to say was that as editor with one assistant, I essentially handled. There were several associate editors who I would send out the manuscripts to review, and it was this very small number of people handling all of these manuscripts that came in for the journal during the course of the year. At this point, you literally need 10 times as many people and so being an editor, I think, certainly means being at a further distance from most of the individual submissions, most of the individual manuscripts that are published, because you simply have to parcel out the work among so many other people, because there are so many manuscripts. But I think the function of journals has got to be the same. It's got to be to basically make the best of research available to as many people as possible. And I realize now that there are larger issues about open source and other kinds of publishing issues that I honestly am not really in touch with. And there'd be other people who could speak better to that aspect of what the best vehicles are for actually conveying scientific research to the broadest audience.
And if you were entering grad school today, would you do anything differently? Would you study any other subjects, or would you seek a trajectory that was much like the one that you took?
I hope I would seek a trajectory that was a hybrid of what you just referred. Some of what I did and some of what I didn't. I mentioned earlier the importance of taxonomy and natural history, and I think that for people going into the fields of evolutionary biology, ecology, animal behavior, the more organism-oriented aspects of whole organism-oriented aspects of biology, I do think that having some familiarity with some group of organisms, gives you a basis to think from, to work from, that I think is really important, as well as the possibility that you will contribute to that knowledge. So I wouldn't want to minimize that at all. And I do think that really every student in my general area of biology should have some such knowledge. What I would do differently from what I personally did as a graduate student is, well, I would say that my greatest limitations are that I was always pretty kind of phobic about learning to do things with my hands. I was really great at reading and interpreting and using words and even occasionally having an idea. But in terms of laboratory technique and so forth, I was not very good at that, and that has been one of the things that I think has been one of my greatest limitations. And I do think it's really important for students to be on top of techniques, and those may be laboratory techniques of how you actually do, the work with DNA or whatever it may be, or especially analytical techniques. And this then brings me to the second, which is that I've never been very strong in math. Having a strong foundation in mathematics, especially then in statistics and broader areas of data analysis of analytical methods for data, especially the new kinds of data that biologists now have access to, with these huge databases and very elaborate analytical methods for dealing with that kind of data. And so I think it's very important to be on top of thinking of the methods that you need to actually be effective in realizing your ideas, your research ideas.
And I think you've largely just answered it, but any additional advice for young scientists?
Become a member of a professional society, for the reasons that I said before, because you should be thinking of yourself as a member of a community, and you should be getting to know your fellow members, both the older ones and your peers, and then eventually, younger ones as well, of course. So I do think that is really important. The being a graduate student, it seems to me that there's a bit of an issue. How do you use your time most effectively? On the one hand, you should be spending some of that time learning what you don't know. So that might be becoming acquainted with a group of organisms, or becoming really adept in some of the analytical methods and so forth. So you should be learning, but you also need to be producing, because it's a very, as I say, a more and more competitive kind of world now. And your PhD advisor, if you're following a PhD, may very well be pressing you to come up with research ideas, or to collaborate either with your advisor or with other students to publish papers. And so that is the reality, is that getting those papers out, even as a graduate student or very soon afterward, is all important, and you have to take that seriously from the start. Your time is valuable, and you have to be using it to accomplish quite a few things.
Well, that sounds like an excellent set of recommendations on which to close. Dr. Futuyma, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences, and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.